With the exception of total victory, nothing in World War II was so eagerly awaited by the peoples of the Allied countries as the invasion of Fortress Europe. Hitler has built the defenses for 4 years, an impregnable wall of concrete, steel, and men. And to crush it and what lies beyond, the Allies mount an army of nearly 3 million men and the greatest sea and air armada the world has ever known.
The stage is being set for the beginning of the great and crucial test all over the world. I have complete confidence that the soldiers, sailors, and airmen, and all the civil populations of the United Nations will demonstrate once and for all that an aroused democracy is the most formidable fighting machine that can be devised.
General Eisenhower had under his command the top military men in both Great Britain and the United States to assist in working out the enormously complex plans for the long-awaited invasion. The directive from the combined chiefs of staff was simple: destroy Hitler's empire, smash it by air, break it wide open, and then invade by sea. The cross-channel assault was the crux of the plan. Early capture of a large port was of the utmost importance. Along the channel where the sea meets France stood Hitler's west wall of concrete, stone, and steel to mock the frail hopes of the Allies.
German strategy in Western Europe will come to be dependent upon a series of fortifications along the coast, which will be known as the Atlantic Wall. The Germans will design divisions called static divisions to man these coastal fortifications, and will attempt to put them along the most likely avenues of Allied invasion. The Allies will choose Normandy as their invasion site partly because the fortifications in Normandy are weaker than they are at other points along the coast.
For 4 years, Hitler's Atlantic Wall has been his obsession. Thousands of laborers have worked to forge its guns, pillboxes, and concrete obstacles into an impregnable barricade. The Nazis know that an Allied invasion is imminent, but they cannot tell when it will come or where. They think the attack most likely will strike where the distance across the channel is narrowest, at Calais. Consequently, their strongest forces and fortifications are concentrated there. The wall would be even stronger if Germany's commander-in-chief in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, believed in it as much as Hitler. With 2,000 miles of coastline to defend, von Rundstedt believes with Frederick the Great that he who defends all defends nothing. Assuming the initial landing will be successful, von Rundstedt plans to move his powerful reserve force up immediately and drive the invasion army back into the sea. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Adolf Hitler summons Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, legendary Desert Fox, to prepare German defenses against the expected Allied invasion. Rommel will be the field commander for von Rundstedt. However, on the day of the invasion, Hitler, having lost confidence in his generals, will direct the strategy against the Allies himself. Rommel's first mission for Hitler is to inspect the Atlantic Wall, the highly publicized line of defense fortifications along the coast of Europe. He's appalled by what he sees. The defenses are shockingly inadequate and in many places non-existent. He calls the wall a gigantic fake, a paper hoop for the Allies to jump through. Rommel warns that if the Allies are not stopped at the water's edge during the first 24 hours of battle, the war will be lost. Concluding that the success of the defense depends on air cover that the dwindling Luftwaffe can no longer provide, Rommel convinces Hitler that the Atlantic Wall must be reinforced in a furious race against time, so certain was he that the Allies would strike sometime that summer. The invasion might come at any point on the 3,000 miles of coastline from Norway to Spain, but the most likely invasion points are in France, one in Normandy, close to Cherbourg, and the other at Calais, only 20 miles from England. Engineering battalions, combat troops, and slave laborers are pressed into service, 500,000 men in all, to build an impregnable Atlantic wall that will stop the enemy at the water's edge. Believing that the invasion force must be destroyed before it ever gets across the beaches, the energetic Desert Fox orders every gap in the wall closed. The high water line, he says, must be the main fighting line. Rommel sets about turning the beach approaches into a nightmare of submerged obstacles, concrete dragons' teeth, hedgehogs, mines, and spikes. On the beaches themselves, the artillery is roofed and walled with concrete, laced together with miles of barbed wire. Thousands of new tank traps, obstacles, and pillboxes are added to the wall. By the end of May, 4 million mines are buried in the Normandy sand. The German heavy coastal guns and fortifications are heavily camouflaged in an effort to fool any Allied reconnaissance from the sea or air. The Atlantic Wall seemed solid enough to withstand any Allied assault. Rommel's men trusted him when he said that any invasion would be another Dieppe.
Auf unsere starken Anlagen, im Hinblick auf den vorzüglichen Geist unserer Truppe, auf die neue Bewaffnung und die Kampfmittel, die uns in die Hand gegeben sind, können wir den kommenden Ereignissen mit größter Ruhe entgegensehen, brauchen uns keine Sekunde den Kopf zerbrechen, ob es gut oder schlecht geht. Es geht bestimmt gut und ich glaube nicht, dass England ein zweites Mal wiederkommt, wenn hier den Versuch macht.
Designed as a probing action for an eventual second front, Dieppe had been a tactical disaster. Elements of the Canadian 2nd Division were sent in without the benefit of a softening up bombardment and were landed directly against heavily fortified German positions. When the survivors withdrew, they left behind 70% of their number. The planners of Operation Neptune, the amphibious component of Overlord, mined valuable experience from Dieppe. Lord Louis Mountbatten later wrote, "For every soldier who died at Dieppe, 10 were saved on D-Day." As preparations forged ahead on both sides of the Channel, Hitler, in a flash of intuition, decided to move a number of strong units into the Normandy area, despite his feeling that Calais would be the invasion point. As a result, in the months just before the landing, the defenses were stiffened considerably. One division ordered back from Hungary is the Panzer Lehr. Drawn from Panzer School demonstration troops, Panzer Lehr was superior to any German division in the West. The 243rd Infantry Division and a number of separate units, some at full strength and full equipment, were also ordered to Normandy, while Allied intelligence expected to land against 3 coastal divisions. In actuality, there had been a significant upgrading of troops in the area. On shore, the Nazis thought they were invincible. However, at sea, they couldn't compete with Allied naval power. To discourage the advance,
our ports is really going to play a part in the both the bodyguard deception and the actual Allied planning. The location of these ports, which are going to be concentrated in the southern part of England, really dictate the location of the invasion to a certain extent. There are no real deep-water ports across from the Pas-de-Calais area, which really makes it difficult for the Allies to stage a successful cross-channel invasion, even though it's the shortest distance. With the ports in the south, Normandy becomes a much more logical choice.
the general plan approved as the outline of the operation the Allies intended to conduct was land on the Normandy coast, build up the resources needed for a decisive battle in the Normandy-Brittany region, and break out of the enemy's encircling positions. Pursue on a broad front with 2 army groups emphasizing the left to gain necessary ports, reach the border of Germany, and threaten the Ruhr. On the right, a link-up would be made with forces that were to invade France from the south. Complete the destruction of enemy forces west of the Rhine while constantly seeking bridgeheads across the river. Overlord planners knew the invasion was most vulnerable in its early stages. For the Allies to get ashore and stay there on D-Day and beyond, it was imperative that the German Wehrmacht, scattered throughout Europe, Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, and the Balkans, be influenced to maintain their positions. If the Germans were able to quickly reinforce their positions in Normandy, their overwhelming firepower and numerical superiority might drive the invaders back into the sea. Toward reaching the objective of keeping German forces scattered, an incredibly intricate and devious deception scheme to hoodwink the Germans on the date and location of the cross-channel invasion was concocted. Codenamed Bodyguard, the plan included 5 erroneous strategic scenarios. The Allies were convinced continued strategic bombing would force Germany into surrender. Invasion could be postponed indefinitely. The Allies would attack German-held Norway in May or June of '44. A series of major Allied operations would be launched against the Balkans in May or June of 44. The Soviets would launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front in July of 44, 2 months after the actual date. Allied commanders were convinced that the earliest possible invasion date was mid-July 1944. Bodyguards strove to create a thin edge for the Allies that might mean the difference between triumph and defeat. But for the plan to work, all elements of Bodyguard had to seem plausible to the Germans. With the Bodyguard plan of deception, the Allies were attempting to pull off the greatest hoax in history.
Intelligence is absolutely critical to the Allies in this plan. And they can send all the false traffic they want to. They can set up all these different ways of deceiving the Germans. But if they can't judge how successful they're being, it's really pretty useless. The stage is set for the success of Bodyguard when the British break the Enigma code early in the war. And in this way, they're able to use intercepted German radio communications to know that they are, in fact, being successful with the Bodyguard deception plan.
All through the spring of 1944, at the Supreme Headquarters in London, plans proceeded for Operation Overlord. Assisting Eisenhower were his 3 top invasion commanders. British Chief Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory would command the Air Forces. Admiral Bertram Ramsay of the Royal Navy was the naval chief. And British General Bernard Montgomery commanded the ground forces. Each man was a mature professional with a lifetime of military experience. All had diligently studied warfare. Yet as a team, they failed to act in complete harmony. To some extent, this problem stemmed from differences in British and American doctrine and training. Mutual trust and confidence were often absent. In private, they resented and belittled one another, with the Americans harboring feelings bordering on contempt for Montgomery. In spite of their differences, they scrupulously observed the chain of command, which descended from Eisenhower. Overlord planners adopted first a master plan and then had to coordinate every last detail of the ground, sea, and air plans. The original invasion plan, which called for an attack along a 3-division front, was expanded into one along a 5-division front. This made the acquisition of more landing craft essential. For these reasons, D-Day was postponed from early May until early June. The air plan sought to gain several objectives. First, by progressively wearing down the Luftwaffe, the Allies would gain control of the skies. Second, the destruction of critical points in rail and highway systems would isolate coastal areas selected for assault and disrupt communications. Long months before D-Day, assault from the sky began. This was the key that would unlock the gate to Fortress Europe. Day and night, the Allied air forces send their bomb cargoes into the vitals of Hitler's self-proclaimed kingdom. Factories, aerodromes, synthetic fuel plants, crude oil refineries, munitions works, railroads, canals, power plants, anything that is part of the war effort becomes a target.
The Allies have divergent views on how to conduct strategic bombing. The British will opt to go with night bombing to reduce the losses in air crews and give them more success in returning aircraft to the base. The Americans will see night bombing as too iffy. They'll want more accurate bombing, and it has to do with the American way of waging war. This divergent view of the Allies will really be very successful for them because, in effect, you'll have bombers over Germany 24 hours a day.
The climax of the air war came in February of 1944 when the Luftwaffe made a desperate effort to sweep our day bombers from the sky. The battle raged for a week. The cost to us was high, but the German Air Force came out of the battle crippled beyond redemption, a ghost of its former power. By D-Day, the German Luftwaffe had been reduced to fewer than 900 planes and was incapable of giving any concentrated air support. Allied superiority in the skies above France had been won. With the Luftwaffe swept from the skies, the tempo of air attacks steadily increased. The heavy air blows against the railroads in France began in April, about 2 months before the tentative invasion date. In order to isolate the battle area in Normandy and hinder the enemy's efforts to bring up men and supplies, it becomes clear that additional time would give the Air Force a better opportunity to accomplish this critical objective. For every bomb dropped on Normandy, 2 were dropped on the Pas-de-Calais to reinforce Fortitude South. Many months before the amphibious assault on Normandy was set to take place, thousands of American soldiers were assigned to Great Britain to participate in the training and buildup of forces to be used in the invasion. For many, the transfer was far from direct. Some would study invasion on the beaches of North Africa and Sicily and Italy before they ever set foot on French soil. But throughout the winter and spring of 1944, great convoys churned across the Atlantic to British ports. Early in the war, German U-boats had reaped a grim harvest on shipping bound for England. However, as 1943 drew to a close, the balance had shifted. The Allies countered the U-boat menace by employing the convoy system, which concentrated merchant shipping into a group that was more easily defended. Coupled with extensive air patrols and killer groups organized around escort carriers, losses to the merchant fleet dropped dramatically. Even so, the North Atlantic crossing was still extremely dangerous.
Actually crossed in one of the largest, I was told, one of the largest convoys ever to go across the Atlantic. I think there was something like 160 ships. And we took 17 days to go across, which is about, I guess, 3 times as long as it usually takes. A submarine got in the convoy and did destroy several ships. And I happened to see one, which was a very, very unpleasant sight to see because it happened to be a tanker and exploded, and you know that there were probably no survivors.
As the convoys slowly plied the waters of the North Atlantic, their holds were virtually bursting with the tools of war. If there was one factor that gave the Allies an edge in the coming battle, it was America's ability to produce staggering amounts of war material in incredibly short order. In addition to the tens of thousands of men America would provide, most of the equipment that would be employed on D-Day had come from the forges of American industry.
The when and where of arrival is not for publication, but the why is common knowledge. Another great influx of American units for the invasion of Europe. When the balloon goes up, these fully trained men will participate in the greatest military expedition in history.
Each month, the United States pours 150,000 of her young men onto the British Isles.
The people were very nice, I say, extremely nice. The countryside is all green, very wet, very damp. The summertime, I think, consisted of approximately a week of good weather spread out. Maybe it was a bad year.
All England becomes an armed camp, one vast depot of armament and supplies. A massive concentration of men and machines becomes the subject of a joke in British pubs. England, they say, would sink into the sea if it weren't for the barrage balloons holding her up.
There was a lot of materiel, tanks, trucks, all kinds of boxes, ammunition and so on the roads, ready to be loaded onto the various ships that were going to take part in the invasion. We all knew that we were going to be part of the operation, and not knowing exactly what.
visits sandwiched between a seemingly endless series of conferences and staff meetings were necessary and highly valuable for the morale of the troops. The men who were to make the greatest assault in history trained exhaustively under conditions similar to those they would probably meet on the continent. The pre-entry phase of the coming battle, joint maneuvers of the ground, sea, and air forces which were to make the attack, were held along the southern coast of England.
We had one night jump in England. It was very dark. You couldn't see anything. I think we got spread out all over England. I don't know what we were doing there, but we had training all over England in the field.
Every duty was performed as if this were the real thing. British shores, chosen for their similarity to the coastlines of the Normandy Peninsula, were the training areas for these maneuvers. The American, British, and Canadian troops who train on England's landing beaches come to know well what it is they're getting ready for. The toughest training Allied troops have faced is thrown at every man. It's grinding, back-breaking, relentless, endless. As the Allies go into high gear for the invasion, the boys get pretty proficient. During training, every bit of gear was doubled, even though during the actual invasion they expected many would lose most of it. The soldiers knew the invasion would be tough, but the training was really intense. Some of the men were carrying as much as 150 pounds of equipment. Imagine running around with all that gear. But they had to. During breaks in training, many soldiers were able to get up to London on a 2-day pass. Wartime Britain was a place supercharged with activity. It was literally the crossroads of the world, filled with uniforms from all the nations united in the war against the Axis. There are no breathers across the English Channel. Rommel must utilize every diabolical mechanical device imaginable to block the invasion. And if the Allies get past the beaches, behind the guns and behind the obstacles are the battle-hardened soldiers and panzer units of the mighty German Wehrmacht, ready to drive them back into the sea. Low areas are flooded beyond the beach to drown paratroopers in the event of airborne landing to the rear of the beaches. Hitler, however, puts his ultimate faith in his newly developed secret vengeance weapon, the V-1 robot bomb and the V-2 guided supersonic rocket. He hopes he can perfect and launch enough of these in time. If so, he is confident he can destroy any Allied invasion force and break the will of the stubborn English people at last. Behind the ever-strengthening West Wall waits Rommel and the German army. They will not have long to wait for their ultimate test. Early in May, Eisenhower and his commanders finalized the major invasion plan. Provided the weather is right, June 5th, 6th, or 7th will be D-Day. Only on those days in June would conditions be ideal for invasion. A full moon to light the way for the airborne troops, and a low morning tide for the landing operations on the beaches. If none of the 3 days should prove satisfactory from the standpoint of weather, consequences would ensue that were almost terrifying to contemplate. The good weather period available for major campaigning would become still shorter, and the enemy's defenses would become still stronger. It was a tense period, made even worse by the fact that the one thing that could provide this disastrous setback was entirely outside the Allies' control. As D-Day loomed nearer, invasion plans continued to take shape. In the first hours of D-Day, paratroopers were to be dropped behind coastal defenses to isolate the beaches. Meanwhile, 5,000 ships carrying the main assault forces would rendezvous in mid-channel to await H hour. At 6:30 a.m., small landing craft will take the troops to the 5 invasion beaches. The Americans will land at Utah and Omaha, the British and Canadians at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Primary objective of the amphibious assault, codenamed Neptune, was to secure a beachhead in Normandy, then capture the port of Cherbourg. Bodyguard machinations continued to spread a web of mystery and confusion over the impending invasion. Intelligence gained through spies and wireless intercepts indicated that the Germans were still uncertain of Allied invasion plans. The presence of 25 Wehrmacht divisions in the Balkans indicated Operation Zeppelin, which suggested the Allies' plan to invade Europe along the Adriatic coast had not been discounted. Similarly, Operation Fortitude North had influenced German command to keep 27 divisions idle in Denmark, Finland, and Norway. In England, preparations were inspected in detail by the highest Allied officials. From the outset, Prime Minister Churchill had clearly and concretely explained his attitude toward and his hopes for Overlord. British experiences at Dunkirk and later at Dieppe had forged strong misgivings in Churchill's mind regarding a cross-channel assault. As the time for the invasion grew nearer, April 30th, 1944, all southern England was suddenly sealed off from the rest of the world. The war's most important secret, the time and place of D-Day, must be kept from the enemy. The army camps along the coast were closed. The success of the invasion for all its machines must depend on these men. The outside world would not hear of them again until the 6th of June.
After I got in England, I got in this replacement depot at Camp Houston in Houndstown. Last part of May, I found myself put into the 1st Infantry Division. I thought I was being put in a stockade, but I'd never been court-martialed or anything, so that's what it looked like, a barbed wire fence around them.
These camps were strange, unsightly places that had sprung up almost overnight and were known to their citizens as shanty towns. Buildings were fashioned entirely from heavy boxes and shipping crates used in transporting thousands of gliders from the United States. Every time a glider moved out of its crate, there were impatient tenants waiting to move in and set up housekeeping or perhaps a business establishment. Everyone in town was there for one purpose, for the day when they would join forces with the British to make the big jump. With so many men staged in southern England, an effort to reinforce Operation Vendetta, the bogus Allied plan to invade the Mediterranean coast of France, was launched. In late May of 1944, actor Clifton James, a dead ringer for General Bernard Montgomery, made several high-profile appearances in Gibraltar and Algiers. Designated Operation Copperhead, the presence of Monty in the Mediterranean suggested to the Germans that a cross-channel invasion was not imminent, or that the Allies would indeed assault southern France. While the Germans were left to sort out conflicting reports, security measures at the camps in southern England were stepped up. The only visitors were very important persons. During the weeks before D-Day, General Eisenhower devoted as much of his time as possible to visiting the troops who were to participate in the attack on Fortress Europe. Urged by some to give up or curtail his visits, with the security measures are intentionally relaxed, is at General George Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group headquarters, 20 miles across the channel from Calais. Here at Dover, the flamboyant Patton commands a ghost army comprised of dummy tanks, dummy trucks, and even a mock invasion fleet. Patton, the general most feared by the Germans, stages noisy, highly conspicuous maneuvers in order to make the Germans believe that the invasion will come at Calais. Although Hitler's intuition tells him that the Allied attack may come at Normandy, 100 miles from England, the reports on Patton change his mind. A component of Fortitude South, known as Operation Quicksilver, The Allied deception plan helps convince Hitler that Calais, only 20 miles from England, is the invasion target. Hitler immediately orders panzer units and infantry divisions brought up to strengthen the Calais district. By June, there will be more than 150,000 men ready in Calais to repel the great Allied invasion.
Well, it seems incredible now that the Allies were able to pull this hoax off, but it really all goes back to the breaking of the Enigma code early in the war. And as the Germans tried to place agents on the ground in England to give them intelligence, the British were able to intercept when they would be arriving and intercept those agents. But rather than have those German agents just disappear, the British began to, in fact, transmit messages back to the Germans in their own code and feed them, in fact, false information about what is going on in England. And this reinforces the whole bodyguard concept.
To keep the Germans confused about the invasion point, the Allies staged numerous probing maneuvers up and down the French coast. In spite of the enormous effort the Allies had undergone to keep the invasion site secret, there were several serious security breaches that could have tipped off the Germans. By mid-April 1944, hundreds of American and British officers were privy to the innermost secrets of Overlord. These officers and the secret documents they studied were codenamed Bigot. One of these men mistakenly left a briefcase containing Bigot documents on a British train. Although the briefcase was recovered, the incident sent shivers through Allied command. On another occasion, Bigot documents blew out an open window onto the streets of London, and only 9 of the original 10 documents were recovered. Explicit Overlord details were overheard being exchanged at several social gatherings, and a copy of the wireless communications plan for D-Day went AWOL for 2 days. Then came the biggest security fright of all.
In late April of 1944, during Operation Tiger, which is pre-invasion training, German E-boats will get in amongst the Allied landing craft and sink some of them, and will lose over 700 people. Part of that 700 people will be 10 Bigot officers. And there'll be an incredible concern on the part of the Allied High Command that the German E-boats have either captured one or more of these individuals alive as a prisoner, or that they've fished the bodies out of the channel with the information possibly still on their person. So the Allies will put an incredible effort out in the channel to find these 10 missing Bigot officers. And eventually they will recover all 10 of their bodies and allay their suspicions or their fears that the Germans may have gotten them.
At bivouac and training areas, ground troops received their alert orders. In the marshalling area, each man drew a gas mask of the latest type, an instantaneous life belt. Field rations were issued, including cigarettes and candy. Dozens of items to be issued and checked.
A week before the invasion, we left the camp and they put us on an airfield in the vicinity, and we stayed on that airfield for approximately 7 days. And we didn't know where we were going at the time. Then they showed us maps of where we were going without the names. It was only 3 days actually before the invasion that we knew exactly where we were going, that it was going to be France and Normandy.
When the men received French folding money, they knew what was what. Now special briefing officers took over. Each unit was briefed individually. The movement movement of the initial invasion task force from the marshalling areas to the embarkation points in southeastern England began on May 30th, when Eisenhower issued the code phrase, Exercise Plus 6, indicating the invasion would be 6 days hence. Monday, June 5th, would be D-Day. For the men, the waiting is over. The march to the sea begins. The timetable called for all troops, vehicles, and supplies to be aboard their transports within 5 days. The men coordination of times of departure and arrival. The operation was executed with expert skill and efficiency. Morale was high, toughened, skilled, easy under discipline. The men knew they were ready. Britain was a sea of movement. Shortly before Eisenhower issued his go-ahead, bodyguard authorities dreamed up yet another ploy to reinforce Operation Quicksilver. It was decided to repatriate an ailing German general being held in a Welsh POW camp through a program administered by the Swedish Red Cross. General Hans Kramer, once a leader in Rommel's vaunted Africa Corps, was driven from Wales eastward across England toward London. Escorted by British double-cross agents, the route took Kramer directly through the genuine assembly areas in southwestern and southeastern England. His cordial escorts let slip that they were going through the Dover region, home to Patton's Ghost Army Group, and since road signposts and the names of towns had been obliterated in anticipation of a German invasion years before, General Kramer had no way of knowing otherwise. In London, Patton even hosted a dinner for the German general, mixing into the evening's conversation fleeting references to the Pas-de-Calais. Back in Germany, Kramer rushed to Berlin, where he reported on what he had seen and heard. Since his report dovetailed neatly with other intelligence sources, largely bodyguard contrivances, Kramer's report was accepted as accurate. The southern portion of England was indeed one vast camp, dump, and airfield. It merely wasn't where the Germans had been led to believe. At the request of Schaeff, the British government stopped all traffic between southern England and the remainder of the United Kingdom. These added inconveniences and privations were accepted by the war-weary British public without a whimper. Southern England was tense as a coiled spring, and indeed that is exactly what it was. A great human spring coiled for the moment when its energy should be released and it would vault the English Channel in the greatest amphibious assault ever attempted. Embarkation of men and equipment took place simultaneously at 9 seaports along the southern and southwestern coasts of England. All vehicles and tanks were loaded backwards on LSTs and LCIs. Concrete and cobblestone embarkation lanes known as hards had been constructed to speed loading. All vehicles embarked with gas tanks filled and sufficient extra gas for 150 miles. Navy and Coast Guard crews made last-minute preparations. All English seashore towns through which military forces passed were quarantined as a precaution against the leakage of information. Had the Luftwaffe commanded the skies at this juncture, it could have inflicted heavy damage on our men and ships, concentrated as they were in this relatively small area. Finally, the very heart of the striking force completes the movement. The men who will spearhead the invasion board the ships, which will carry them to their long-awaited hour of decision.
We were moved into a camp just outside Plymouth, and waited there for a couple of days, and then were loaded onto a troop ship, and we moved out into the channel, and we just stayed there for I've forgotten probably 2, 3, 4 days, because so much material was moving through the port that they had to get ships out of the port so that more ships could come in and load up this stuff, and along with other troops and so on.
Each man carried one K and one D ration. No extra clothing or barracks bags on this trip. General Eisenhower said of these men, there is no question at all as to the readiness of the troops. They are well-trained, fit, and impatient to get the job started and completed. Small assault boats ran a continuous shuttle service from the hards and docks to the transports lying at anchor in the harbor. The arithmetic of logistics, however, could not have clicked without the spirit of frictionless teamwork which prevailed among the staffs and men of the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard. German reconnaissance flights flew daily missions across the Channel, and part of the cover-up plan allowed them to fly over the Dover area in southeastern England. At the altitude they were flying, the dummy tanks, planes, and landing craft of Patton's Ghost First Army Group looked quite realistic. However, any approach these same planes made to southern and southwestern England was driven off by very aggressive fighter activity, and there was a feeling among some German commanders that this indicated the invasion would take place at Normandy.
Now, what this is going to cause is a dichotomy within the German High Command. Some will begin to believe that, in fact, it'll reinforce their opinion that the area of concern is Calais. On the other hand, this will bring to the minds of other German commanders the idea that the real invasion is actually sited somewhere else because of this problem with intelligence gathering. And you'll find, for instance, Rommel will increasingly lobby for the release of panzers and artillery being held in reserve in the Calais area to be released to reinforce the Normandy beaches, which he sees as being increasingly threatened. However, his efforts are in vain, and those requests are not granted.
The last of the ships which were to participate in the D-Day assault were loaded to capacity, and the time for departure from the English coast was finally at hand. With the mechanics of logistics done, the eye of destiny is now on these men who board their vessels, bringing only what they can carry on their backs and in their hearts. They may not see themselves as the sword-bearers of the crusade, but they know well enough what depends on their efforts. Now begins a new period of waiting for one final word. An invasion ship is a lonely ship, writes a correspondent who was there. It's a strange and suspended world, but heavy with memories of the more familiar world left behind. Unknown to the men in the tense atmosphere of the invasion fleet, tension is also high at Supreme Headquarters. June 3rd dawns gray and dull, marks the beginning of the worst channel weather in decades. The first ships are on their way to their rendezvous in the channel when they are hit by unexpected storms. Weather, the one element beyond the control of the Allied High Command, threatens the success of the invasion. Now all the invasion timing depended on the tide for the landing of troops, moonlight for the airborne, calm seas, and the simultaneous beginning of the new Russian offensive. All the careful planning hangs on the weather report. Ike refuses to risk disaster and postpones D-Day for at least 24 hours. The advance convoys of the fleet, already en route to invasion, are ordered back. German weather stations track the storm, and their forecasters make the same prediction as the Allied meteorologists. The worst storm in 20 years is approaching the English Channel, and the weather will continue bad for at least a week. Lulled into a sense of security, the German Navy cancels mine-laying operations and its nightly E-boat patrols. All planes are grounded. Rommel estimates that an Allied invasion is not possible during the next 2 weeks. Exhausted from overwork, he decides to go home to Germany for a few days' rest. Besides, Tuesday, June 6th, will be his wife's birthday. In England, at the embarkation ports, the Allied forces are confined to their ships. As the men wait, Eisenhower faces another tortured decision. If the bad weather continues, the invasion will have to be put off until June 19th, when the tide will again be right. And if he does postpone, how can he keep the invasion secrets locked up among 250,000 men? How will the long delay affect their morale? The storm at sea now moved inland, striking southern England with its full fury. The situation looked more hopeless than ever. The Allied weather stations report from far out in the North Atlantic, from Greenland, from places where German meteorologists cannot get information. They predict the possibility that the storm front may lift for a 24-hour period on Tuesday, June 6th, and the news is relayed to Eisenhower's headquarters. In an old English mansion near the invasion harbor of Portsmouth, a dramatic conference takes place. Eisenhower and his commanders meet to consider whether they should launch the invasion on Tuesday. The opinions are divided, some doubtful, some yes. But the final word, the fateful decision, must come from Eisenhower. There's a moment of silence. Then he says, "Okay, let's go. D-Day will be Tuesday, June 6th. From Plymouth and Dartmouth, from Poole and New Haven, from Torquay and Portsmouth they come. Battleships, minesweepers, destroyers, rocket barges, tugboats, and landing craft. More than 6,000 vessels in all. The greatest invasion armada in the history of man. Meanwhile, in Hitler's luxurious mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, the Führer enjoys a peaceful day with his mistress, Eva Braun. He will hold 2 military conferences with his staff and spend the late hours of his evening listening to Wagner. Along the Atlantic Wall, there is nothing unusual to report. All is quiet on the Western Front. It took 2,172 days to win the Second World War, and the 6th of June, 1944, may be the best remembered. On this D-Day, the Allies sailed on Hitler. The largest combined land, air, and sea operation of all time was launched from bases in southern England to liberate Europe from its Nazi oppressors. Planned by the ablest Allied commanders and spearheaded by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion script had come down to this. In the first hours of D-Day, paratroopers were to be dropped behind coastal defenses to isolate the beaches. Meanwhile, 5,000 ships carrying the main assault forces would rendezvous in mid-channel to await H-hour. At 6:30 a.m., small landing craft will take the troops to the 5 invasion beaches. The Americans will land at Utah and Omaha, the British and Canadians at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Primary objective of the amphibious assault, codenamed Neptune, was to secure a beachhead in Normandy, then capture the port of Cherbourg. That was the plan. But in spite of the countless hours of preparation that had gone into developing Overlord, the outcome was by no means certain. Had the Germans sifted through the bodyguard cover-up schemes and determined the true invasion site? As little as 48 hours warning might spell disaster. Supremely confident in his men, General Eisenhower expected nothing less than total victory. But as the invasion armada put forth from the ports of southern England, the weight of the world was squarely on his shoulders. Covered by watchful air fighters, the invasion fleet sailed on the morning of June 5th. American units left their various harbors in southeastern England to meet the British units at a rendezvous off the Isle of Wight. Under complete radio silence, each ship took its proper place in the vast armada. Across the same storm-tossed English Channel, which 356 years earlier had defeated a proud Spanish armada, now steamed over 6,000 ships, converging on France with the precision of a dress parade. The Luftwaffe has been broken, the U-boats driven from the Channel. The vanguard of 35 divisions moves unmolested toward the beaches. They were approaching their final positions as the sun began to set. At twilight came the signal for the dash across the Channel. Minesweepers cleared 10 lanes through the Germans' mid-channel minefields, and along these safe passages sailed the invasion fleet.
As the invasion fleet puts out to sea, the British and Americans will attempt to again deceive, as part of bodyguard, the German radar installations along the coast. The installations in the Calais area will not be attacked, and there will be a couple of small flotillas equipped with radar deflectors sent north towards Calais to simulate a large invasion fleet approaching. Meanwhile, in the southern Normandy region, the radar sites will be intensely attacked, and on the night of the invasion, Allied bombers will drop huge amounts of chaff to blind the German radar in the southern area. What the Allied planners hope that as the reports of these various contacts and efforts are sent up the chain of command, that they'll coalesce into a fact in the mind of the Germans that the invasion is headed toward Calais.
As the invasion fleet slowly moved through the mid-channel waters toward Normandy, the sea grew incredibly rough. For many of the warriors aboard the vessels pitching helplessly on the rolling water, seasickness is a cruel enemy to be fought before the Germans are ever faced.
The group I was with said we were going out to come back and attack England again. They had been doing that quite a bit. We stayed out overnight. The next morning, they began to get worried a little bit that we weren't attacking England.
By 0200, the vast armada of ships totaling 6,483 vessels of all kinds had reached the assembly area, 10 miles off the coast of Normandy. The immense convoy of seaborne assault forces stood deployed against 50 miles of French coastline. The men who will actually be the first into France are still back on English soil. Paratroopers of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division are to jump behind enemy lines to secure the flanks of the invasion area. The success of their mission depends upon the rapid destruction of certain key enemy installations. Intelligence officers have warned the Supreme Commander that the airborne assault is too hazardous to succeed. But without it, the landings may fail. Eisenhower faces a crucial decision. Should he risk the slaughter of 3 superb divisions, or should he cancel the drop and imperil the whole invasion? He orders the paratroopers to France. At command departure points, gliders and their tow planes were standing ready for the night's operation. Speeds and altitudes were assigned to tow plane pilots, and glider pilots were given a final briefing on all that was known to intelligence regarding the conditions likely to be found in the drop zones. Each unit's mission was clearly defined. General Eisenhower paid a last-minute visit to the airborne infantry to wish them well. These men were assigned to 6 Pathfinder units. Takeoff 2310 hours of D-1. Time for the airborne spearhead to get going. 20,000 men are to disembark from 22 airfields. 1,200 transport aircraft and 700 gliders were to be used in the greatest airborne assault in history. Paratroopers filed out of hangars and marched to their planes. Each combat team carried adequate equipment to complete its mission independently, for it was recognized that a night drop into heavily defended enemy territory by such large forces was bound to create a wild state of confusion on both sides. Parapacks of heavy equipment carried under the planes would be released separately. Gliders were loaded with equipment first. Each pilot checked his list of passengers. Paratroopers put on their full load of equipment, adjusting each item with extreme care. To hit the dirt just right with a full load of equipment is a highly specialized business, especially at night. Final check by the jump master, the most particular man in the outfit. Paratroopers board their planes. Lead packs containing demolition supplies will be released by the men while in midair. Thus, each man will hit the dirt close to his pack. Climbing into the transports, some of the men were so loaded down that they had to be shoved on board by other paratroopers. The crucial hours of darkness ahead will make almost superhuman demands on them. Bad weather and anti-aircraft fire will scatter many of them over a much wider distance than is planned. In small groups and on unfamiliar terrain, they will be forced to fight the enemy as they find them in the night. But dawn will find the flanks at either end of the Normandy battlefield held by these first invaders. None of this, of course, can they know as they board their planes in the late hours before D-Day. With the roar of engines, the Pathfinder ships began taking off. Each Pathfinder unit carried navigation beacons to guide the transports in, and lights to aid jump masters in determining when to send their men out.
I was part of the defense platoon. It was called the defense platoon of the 82nd Airborne. We were guarding the division headquarters where General Gavin at the time was. Our mission was to assemble and guard the division headquarters.
I was there on the ship, and I heard the planes going over. Initially, those were the paratroopers, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, and then we knew something was really up.
We left England and started to flow around for about 1 hour. Then the plane started going in one direction, then we flew over the water. The moon was out, I remember, but there were clouds. So there were times that you could see and times where it was very dark. At one point, there was anti-aircraft fire coming from one of the islands in the channel, and the order was given to stand up and hook up. I was number 2 in the plane, which was facing the doorway. So we stood up, hook up, and hang on to the cable. And I can remember one thing I know for sure. I stood like that for 45 minutes. That's a very long time. At one time, our plane got caught in anti-aircraft fire, and the plane dove for the treetops. I think that must have been just about where the point where we were going to jump. And before we knew it, we were over the water on the other side again. Then the plane turned around, flew over the coast again, inland from the other side, flew a few minutes, and give us the green light, and we jumped. The result of the jump is that naturally we jumped in the wrong place. We didn't know where we were, and it was pretty much of a mess. Since we jumped out of the plane while the plane is going, that means you spread out over pretty close, 3/4 of a mile or so, and you reassemble against the middle. We had the heavy equipment such as machine guns, bazookas, and BARs in equipment bundles under the plane. They were released under the plane. They were spread out. So it took quite a while for all the men to gather together and go find this equipment, which was spread out all over. Nothing went according to plan, but I think the result was just as good. The men were spread out all over the place, but it was just as well. It was really mass confusion from the Germans because since we were all over the place, they didn't know how many we were. Every time they turned around, they'd run into us.
The Allies knew the invasion was most vulnerable in its early stages. If able to land enough troops and establish deep enough penetration, it would be difficult for the Germans to dislodge them. The first few days and weeks would tell the story. Allied High Command was aware that the Germans expected the invasion to take place at Calais, and Operation Fortitude South went to great lengths to further this perception. But to maintain the deception, once Neptune was fully underway, was quite another matter. It was imperative to keep the German High Command confused as to the nature and scope of the Normandy landings.
Titanic is a code name for an airborne deception plan that the Allies put on. What they do is they drop British commandos with record players and amplifiers in behind German lines that have recorded sounds of airborne landings and gunfire on them. And in conjunction with those landings, they also drop thousands of dummy half-sized dummy paratroopers over France, both in the invasion area and on a wider front. And the result of these drops is to confuse the Germans and cause them to dispatch troops to deal with these theoretical airborne landings. And what that does is disperses their strength, causes the real airborne landings to meet less opposition, and also draws troops away from the beaches that will not be there to defend against the landings.
In the early morning of June 6th, the first group of gliders were pulled off the ground and towed out across the channel to be cut loose over the area where the paratroopers had dropped earlier. The heavily armed men in them, a short while before, had listened to a message from the Supreme Commander. You're about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you, as are the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. I have every confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. The first lifts of gliders to come in had their share of difficulties. In the American sector, the second glider in managed to wipe out all of the landing lights that had been set up by the Pathfinders. Like their paratroop counterparts, many gliders were scattered well away from their intended landing zones. Almost all were heavily damaged, but the majority of the jeeps, ammunition, and artillery pieces they carried were delivered intact.
The first person I met turned out to be a member of the 101st Airborne. He had a cricket, you know, the metal thing that goes click, click, was going. I was hearing this click, click all over the place, wondering what it was. We had a password, so I give him a password he's supposed to answer to me, and he answered by click, click. And I didn't know anything about this click, click. It turned out to be a disaster there. Anyway, nobody was trigger happy, so he went on his way. He was disgusted. He wasn't the one I was looking for. He went away, click, click, click. And I went my own way trying to find the rest of the man I jumped with, and I eventually found them. We were heading for Sainte-Mère-Église, and we finally reached the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. It must have been about 8 o'clock in the morning.
Sainte-Mère-Église was the first town to be captured by the American paratroopers early on D-Day morning.
Sainte-Mère-Église is a town with a square with a church and trees. And when we walked in, I can remember there were paratroopers, dead paratroopers hanging in the trees. Unfortunately, they landed, their parachute got caught in the trees, and the town had been occupied by the Germans.
In addition to seizing key spots to facilitate the advance of the major forces, the airborne troops proved even more invaluable as scouts.
I was used as an interpreter to find out, to ask questions about what the Germans were, how many they were, what units they had, what type of equipment, none.
The entire airborne effort is really assisted in part by a lack of an aggressive German response. Although there's localized stiff resistance in certain areas, generally speaking, the Germans are very slow to react to the airborne landings behind the Normandy beaches. The airborne divisions were able to accomplish their primary objectives, which was the seizure of key beach exits in the American sector and critical bridges behind the British sector. They were also able to accomplish their secondary mission, which was the screening of the landings early on the morning of the 6th.
Meanwhile, in the rough waters of the Channel, the giant invasion fleet was proceeding carefully toward the French coast. One of the most important and dirtiest of preparatory jobs was done by the minesweepers, which moved in and exploded mines just off the coast, clearing safe channels for the assault boats. Virtually every type of light assault vessel was pressed into use for the operation. The invasion armada, with its complement of over 6,000 ships and small craft, carried 150,000 troops, thousands of vehicles and weapons, and tons of supplies. In spite of close quarters in the Channel, the vast invasion fleet made the crossing successfully, suffering the loss of not a single vessel by German action. The GIs and Navy gun crews waited expectantly for an enemy air attack, but not one German plane appeared. The Germans, though surprised by our attack in relatively rough weather, were quick to contest the invasion. The coastal defenses, which they had spent years in preparing for this moment, were readied for action. While the troops prepared to go ashore, the savage battle for domination of the beaches started. Streams of heavy, medium, light, and fighter bombers crossed the Channel for the most intensive airstrike of the entire war. Shattering the dawn 90 minutes before H-hour, the aerial bombardment began. Charged with the responsibility of demolishing selected targets in the enemy's coastal defenses, providing overhead cover, and rendering general fighter bomber support, the air plan sought to isolate the battle area until the ground forces could consolidate the beachheads and begin the breakthrough. Other fire support was available as offshore warships prepared to open the Western Front with a barrage of gunfire. Some 600 Allied warships trained their heavy guns on any German coastal defenses that had not been knocked out by the Allied air bombardment. Battleship Nevada is there, torpedoed at Pearl Harbor, a flagship at Normandy. At 05:30, 1 hour before touchdown of the ground troops, the naval guns open up. The enemy had long known he would be invaded, but he did not know when or where. The answer resounded with deafening clarity from the ships standing off the Normandy coast. Inside Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the Germans know what the world does not. The assault is on. Defeated in the north, defeated in the south, defeated in the east, the Germans have but one hope left: destroy the invaders from the west. Shell tonnage was expended in the next hour than in all the Allied naval campaigns of World War I. Warship had its assigned targets. It was acknowledged that dust and smoke from the aerial bombing would obscure shore targets, so fire was based on map coordinates and according to strict timetables. While the battle raged on, the transports prepared to send their troops ashore. The infantry had spent 18 wretched hours on the pitching sea, and the vomit bags were gone. Now, in the calmer offshore waters, the nausea was lifting. Strangely, the fear was evaporating. The terrible waiting was over. There was nothing left to do but go and fight. "48-hour rations, some French money, a rifle, and the last few soggy jokes." The waves are high, the clouds are low and threatening. But by dawn, all the convoys are unloading their human and mechanical cargo into landing craft. In a world of nausea and tension, the trip to the beaches begins. At the spear tip of this historic seaborne attack are some 3,000 men, American, British, and Canadian troops who will hit in the first wave. Behind them, the main body of ground forces will land in succeeding waves. Naval gunners raised their sights as the assault boats went in and smashed at the enemy's gun batteries farther inland. Yet so ingeniously fortified was this coastal zone that despite the deluge of bombs and shells from our air and sea bombardment, enemy counterfire was still effective as our men neared the beaches. After the planes and warships had done their jobs, the final outcome of the mighty battle depended largely on the infantrymen. The GIs and the landing boats were fully aware that they were the center of attention. Loaded with 32 men each, the landing craft start the run for the beach. D-Day, H-Hour, that fateful moment for which the whole world held its breath. The invasion was on. At 0630, the first landing craft touched down on Utah Beach. A strong current worked in favor of the Americans at Utah, carrying the landing some 2,000 yards south of the intended landing sites. The obstacles at that point were far less formidable, and quick thinking exploited the situation. Men were fed into the area, thereby avoiding heavier losses that might have been suffered at the intended landing point. Shocked by the bombardment and the overwhelming numbers of men waiting ashore, many German defenders at Utah surrendered at first contact. The initial landings were very quickly accomplished. Link up with members of the 101st Airborne was rapid. The 101st had secured 4 exits off the beach, and by the end of D-Day, they had a beachhead 6 miles deep. Once off the beach, however, flooded land behind the landing slowed the American advance to a crawl. Of the 23,000 men landed at Utah, only 197 casualties were taken on D-Day. While everything is right on Utah Beach, to the southeast, nearly everything goes wrong on the 4-mile stretch of beach designated Omaha. For the 8 companies of men coming into Omaha Beach, the Rommel nightmare begins to come true. It's here that the bloodiest battle of D-Day was being fought. It was anticipated that Omaha would be difficult. Dominated by sheer 100-foot cliffs at either end, the narrow beach was heavily strewn with obstacles and backed by a seawall and a steep bank of coarse pebbles, impassable to vehicles in most places. The only way off the beach was through 5 narrow draws. To make matters worse, the formidable 352nd Infantry Division had been brought up to reinforce the area, and as a result, the Americans at Omaha faced 8 enemy battalions rather than the 4 they had planned on. The troops at Omaha were in trouble from the outset. Landing craft and amphibious transports foundered on the 12-mile run inshore, carrying hundreds of men and dozens of artillery pieces to the bottom. The first wave of men hitting the beach at Normandy had no armor and no heavy guns to support them in the face of murderous enemy fire. Only a few German positions had been seriously damaged during the preliminary bombardment, and German artillery tore into the landing craft as they approached, causing some to sink. Unable to swim due to their heavy equipment, many men drowned.
As we were going into the beach on this landing craft, Coxman or whatever he was running the thing, he got up to the beach and he says, "I can't let the ramp down. I'm going to have to back out in deeper water. You're going to have to go over the side." So he backed out into the water where it's about 8 feet deep, I guess, and we bailed out over the sides, and then there were shells flying over our heads. I was in with the first wave. They called it Easy Red. I was in it.
As the ramps of the first landing craft dropped, the American line was raked by machine gun fire from one end to the other. Amid sinking tanks and exploding landing craft raked by machine gun fire, those who survived the initial onslaught plunged into water waist to neck deep and began wading ashore, taking cover behind the very obstacles built to deter the landings. In the confusion, boats went astray or got out of control and crashed into one another. Forced to jump out of sinking boats, many men had to discard their weapons and equipment to save themselves from drowning. Dragged from the frigid water, they were in no condition to battle the Germans. The assault on Omaha was rapidly becoming a shambles. The engineers assigned to clear and mark lanes through the obstacles were unable to because troops refused to leave the cover they offered. When subsequent waves came in, they only added to the chaos. The losses in the first hour were awesome. As the tide crept in, so too did the Americans. Those who had successfully negotiated the beach found themselves pinned down below the seawall or the pebble bank at the top of the beach.
It isn't too clear what I was doing, but I got in on the beach and I knew that I didn't want to stay there. There was too many others laying around there and wounded and so forth. So as we was coming up the beach, there's this cliff off to our right. This cliff was pretty high, and when I come up off of the beach, I noticed a lot of fellas is hugging up there against this cliff to keep out of the shelling. And I was told later that that was the Point du Hoc.
Exhausted, shocked, uncertain what to do in the face of relentless enemy fire, the bewildered troops were slow to move off the beaches. Officers who tried to rally the men ran from group to group, promptly becoming targets. At the risk of hitting American troops, destroyers swept in to provide direct artillery support for the infantry. All morning they fired, and into the afternoon, delivering an endless barrage of thunderous salvos. It was almost 10:00 before there was any confirmation that even one soldier had set foot on Omaha. The men of the 2 British and 1 Canadian divisions that landed on D-Day faced terrain far less formidable than that at Omaha. The gently sloping beach was backed by a series of small summer resorts, and behind the resorts lay open, flat terrain. The fortunes of the British and Canadians on Gold, Sword, and Juno were dictated in large part by a threat the Americans did not have to face: tanks. The British knew at least one Panzer division stood between them and their primary D-Day objectives: capturing the heavily fortified city of Caen and securing the Allied eastern flank. A rapid move inland would be necessary to withstand an anticipated assault by German panzers. The British fired at fortified houses as they came in, smashing many a sniper's nest and observation posts. In the British sector, special duty engineers were to hit the beach first, with the medics and infantry following. The British 30 Corps was responsible for Gold Beach on the extreme west of the British sector. Their objective was Bayeux. First ashore were the flail tanks that cleared lanes through barbed wire and minefields for the infantry. Then, shortly before 0730, the gates of the landing craft clanged open. How the British soldiers fared at Gold had much to do with where they landed. Some came ashore to little opposition, while others suffered greatly before resolute defenders. On the extreme right, troops of the British 50th Division ran into the easternmost parts of the German 352nd Infantry Division, which was giving the Americans so much trouble on Omaha. Despite attacking over better terrain, the British fared little better. Troops arriving in the second wave found scattered concentrations of bodies and spreading stains of blood clotting in the sand. Still, after a few hours, men of the 50th cut the Bayeux-Caen road, preventing tanks from reaching the vulnerable Americans on Omaha. At Juno Beach, the center of the British sector, high seas had wreaked havoc on the assault boats. 20 of the first 24 landing craft carrying elements of the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division were lost or damaged due to mines or shore obstacles. Like the Americans on Omaha, the Canadians lost most of their armored and artillery support on the run-in shore. The Germans at Juno were not as quick to fold as on Utah. Advances were made through the practice of bypassing pockets of resistance which lead troops were engaging. Canadian troops succeeded in linking up on their right with the British on Gold to form a solid beachhead 12 miles long and 6 miles deep by the day's end. But the left flank was still separated from the British on Sword by 2.5 miles of enemy-held territory. Sword Beach, a naval port guarded by heavy gun emplacements, was where the real danger lurked in the British sector. Somewhere behind the beach, tanks of the 21st Panzer Division awaited the 3rd British Infantry Division. The landing at Sword went relatively smoothly, and by 1600 the troops, with tanks and some anti-tank guns, had advanced to within 3 miles of their D-Day objective, the city of Caen. But there, the advance stalled when 40 powerful Mark IV Panzers were encountered, and the first big tank battle of the invasion erupted. When the two forces disengaged, the British pressed on toward Caen, men were finally stopped only 2 miles from the town by intense German fire. As the British dug in for the night, no one could have known that it would be weeks before Caen would finally fall. Throughout the early stages of Neptune, the German High Command remained oblivious to the landings. Field Marshal Rommel was at home, and Adolf Hitler and his Chief of Staff, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, were both sound asleep. It was not until after noon that reserves were authorized to reinforce the Normandy sector. The lack of swift action was due largely to fortitude south. German intelligence reported that among the troops landing at Normandy, no units of Patton's fictional 1st U.S. Army Group were present. The notion that Normandy continued to be viewed as a sideshow was confirmed by the Allied architects of Bodyguard.
In England, as the invasion goes in, signal operators are listening to the German radio communications. And what they're listening for is the German code words, which is initiate case 3, which is the German signal for the commitment of the mobile reserves to contest the beach landings. However, the German High Command is convinced that this Normandy invasion is simply a deception or part of the Allied diversionary plan, and that signal is never sent.
The main event was far to the southwest in Normandy, and of all the beaches, it was on Omaha Beach that the struggle was fiercest, the outcome most in doubt. Fortunately for the men on the beaches, they were not fighting alone. On D-Day, 10,000 flights of aircraft battered German defenses with more than 11,000 tons of bombs. Behind the landings, Allied planes release a barrier of bombs that cut off German reinforcements, paralyzed German counter moves. Every road, every bridge, every rail line, every canal, all the way back into Germany was smashed, isolating French beaches. The fury from the air went on and on. Pilots in tactical support of the ground forces took no rest that day. Back from one sortie, they gassed up, loaded their bombs and ammunition belts, and grimly went out again and again. By 1100, the battle at Omaha was finally beginning to flow for the Americans. Convinced that enemy fire was not going to get any lighter by waiting, coordinated efforts began to move forward. At the exits to the beach, fresh troops and newly landed tanks began to capture German strongpoints weakened by the ferocious aerial and naval bombardment. Finally, at 13:30, V Corps was able to radio 1st Army Commander Bradley on board the cruiser Augusta that troops formerly pinned down on the beaches were advancing inland. When darkness fell, V Corps clung to a precarious beachhead 6 miles long and less than 2 miles deep. Already the Americans had sustained 3,000 casualties. The tenuous hold on Omaha would depend on what the Germans could throw against the landing in the days to follow.
There were rumors, as there always are in the Army, of course, or in the service. We did hear that they landed successfully and that they were moving inland.
Allied advance throughout the French coastal area was slowed down considerably by German obstacles. The entire region had been liberally planted with mines, and detection units reaped an abundant harvest on the country near the beaches. Once cleared, the troops could again move forward, but for many, it went from bad to worse. The troops who struggled off the beaches ran into yet another formidable barrier, the hedgerows of Normandy, which would become so notorious in the coming weeks. It seemed nearly every hedgerow contained a German sharpshooter determined to make the Americans pay a steep price as they worked inland. Part of the invasion's success lay in the German reaction to the ongoing bodyguard deception plan. Allied radio broadcasts on Invasion Day, all carefully scripted, deliberately referred to the landings as preliminary in nature and just one phase of a grand invasion plan. Winston Churchill, while addressing the Parliament, furthered the deception, calling the invasion the first in a series of planned landings. German high command was paralyzed, convinced that Normandy was the first and probably lightest of the blows to come. Accordingly, reserves were kept out of the battle, including the formidable panzer divisions. The overall result could not have been better. With the tide of battle beginning to flow in favor of the Allies, Troop Carrier Command was ready for its next move. They had amassed hundreds of British and American gliders in preparation for the most gigantic aerial towing job ever attempted. Each held a full cargo of jeeps and guns and the fighting men to use them. The lives and success of those who were already in France depended on the flight of this vast armada. Reinforcements were needed to relieve the units already ashore in Normandy, some of which had been under direct enemy attack since they landed. An unbroken chain of planes and gliders stretching from England to France and back again carried with it the men and material necessary to sustain the invasion. As the aerial fleet sailed out over the channel, it was extremely vulnerable to air attack. This was the Luftwaffe's big chance. The Allied air forces had established air supremacy, and the gliders and their tugs were covered by an umbrella of fighters. But if there was ever a time that German flyers would try anything to break through, this was the time. Yet not a single German plane was encountered. The second glider lift was scheduled to go in during the last hours of daylight in support of the paratroops landed before H hour. Medics, radio personnel, and a large number of troops sailed over the invasion beaches, oblivious to the carnage below them. In addition to their substantial human cargo, the gliders carried jeeps, ammunition, supplies, bulldozers, and artillery pieces, notably anti-tank guns. Approaching the French coast, German anti-aircraft fire opened up. In one lift of 50 glider-tug combinations bound for the American sector, 37 of the C-47 tug aircraft were hit, and 2 others shot down. Landing Zone W was still in German hands as the last lifts came in, and attempts to divert them failed. They came down to a hail of fire. 15-foot poles driven into the ground ripped off wings and smashed through fuselages. Yet those broken wings served the highest purpose. They carried an army into Normandy. By late afternoon, the coastal region had become an enormous staging area. Standing offshore, LSTs unloaded supplies onto smaller LCTs. Heavier equipment was transferred to giant rhino ferries, flat-bottomed barges that were landed ashore. And with the armor and supplies came reinforcements, thousands of men to strengthen and broaden the landing. Out in the channel, rescue boats of the Coast Guard searched for survivors and aided damaged vessels, while the hospital ships received load after load of the dead and wounded. The beach was firmly in Allied hands, and the vast extent of the operation was plainly visible. Defeated and disarmed, the first German soldiers captured in France await evacuation. The assault phase of Operation Overlord was a tremendous victory for the Allies. While the German High Command had looked to the Pas de Calais, more than 150,000 men and hundreds of tanks had landed in Normandy without a single massed counterattack. 6 beachheads were established, despite the punishing fire from Rommel's Atlantic Wall defense. With the troops moving inland everywhere, it was apparent that the gamble had paid off. The Allies had won their foothold on the continent. But the victory had come at a high cost. Apparent everywhere was the silent evidence of a fierce battle. Nearly 12,000 casualties were taken on D-Day, with losses on Omaha Beach being especially heavy. 3,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing there on that first day alone. Behind the survivors lay those who died to enslave the world, and those who died to free it.